ladies and gentlemen, dear distinguished guests, dear colleagues and our students, I'm very happy that I can welcome you to the very first Translation, Interpreting and Culture Conference organized here in the premises of Faculty of Arts of the Constantine Philosopher University in Nitre. I'm very delighted that the topic of our conference, All Dogmas, New Approaches, has attracted so many international speakers. Really, after receiving more than 100 proposals from more than 20 countries, our scientific committee has selected those which they regarded as the strongest ones. That means those which were written by all of you who are here with us today. We are very grateful for the many compelling perspectives on development and maybe also future development of translation and interpreting studies. And we are excited about the fascinating debates which are ahead of us in the next 3 days. Forming an international platform to share ideas and discuss our methodologies was the crucial aim when creating this event, together with our colleagues from Matejbel University in Banská Bystrica, Comenius University in Bratislava, Prešov University, and the Institute of World Literature of the Slovak Academy of Sciences. The cooperation among these 5 main players, including our Department of Translation Studies from Constantine Philosopher University, did not come about by accident. It is a result of many years of cooperation, either scientific or training related. Furthermore, I am very happy that another principal partner has joined us, and I am very happy that we were able to gain the support of Directorate General for Translation of the European Commission via the Translating Europe workshop scheme. The TIC conference, as we call it here, is a joint venture which will take place every 2 years, with the first one being organized here in Nitre. I'm very pleased that the idea was received the most warmly by the leadership of our university. And therefore, I would personally like to welcome Dr. Martina Pavlikova, Vice Rector for International Relations, and I would like to ask her for a few words.
Dobré ráno, dámy páni, ja som sa rozhodla, že dnešný príhovor bude mať v slovenskom jazyku. Dovolte mi privítať vás v priestoroch Univerzity Konštantína Filozofa v Nitre, kde mi je veľkou cťou predstaviť vám katedru translatológie ako jednu z najlepších katedier na Slovensku. Sme veľmi hrdí, že práve naša univerzita sa môže pyšniť touto katedrou. Chcela by som sa poďakovať Filozofickej fakulte a jej pani dekánke, docentke Jarmile Jurovej, ako aj pani vedúcej katedry, doktorke Emilie Perez, za to, že zorganizovali túto úžasnú konferenciu. Ďakujem.
Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne. Ďakujem vám veľmi pekne, pani prorektorka. Thank you very much for your kind words. And as you already mentioned, the leadership of the faculty as well, I would like to use the opportunity and welcome both the previous and the present leadership of our Faculty of Arts, and I would like to thank them for their support and help, which was more than generous. Now I would like to give the floor to the new dean of our faculty, Jarmila Jurova, and I'm very happy that even though she's very busy this week, she was able to join us for today.
Esteemed Vice Rector, distinguished guests, honored colleagues and students, it's a great honor for me to welcome you to Nitre on behalf of the Faculty of Arts of our university. When I first saw the proposals for this event, I was genuinely impressed, and now seeing such a collection of respected participants from so many countries presenting their research in the field of translation and interpreting studies, I can confidently say that this is a truly special occasion, and not only for our university, but also for Slovakia, I hope. We are very proud to have our Department of Translation Studies hosting the first year of the TIC conference, and based on previous experience, I'm certain they will set the highest of standards. As Dean of the Faculty, I'm also very glad that this conference will strengthen cooperation between Slovak faculties and institutes focusing on language, culture, translation, and interpreting. I would also like to welcome the representatives of the DGT, of the European Commission, industry associations, companies, professional associations and professionals, and thank them for being here with us today. Your participation is vital, as it is appreciated. I'm sure there will be many invigorating debates and fruitful discussions taking place in the next few days, and I look forward to learning about their outcomes. This conference will undoubtedly become one of the significant events in our faculty's calendar, and I wish the organizers a great deal of success, not only for this year, but also in the coming months. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your kind words, and let's hope we will be able to fulfill your expectations, but I'm sure we will. Thank you very much. I really appreciate you could join us for today. Well, another aim of the conference, as was already mentioned, was to join academia with translation and interpreting practice, which is something we feel is very important to do today. Being able to list part of today's program within the Translation Europe workshop scheme helped us greatly, and we are pleased to have strengthened our cooperation with DGT even more. I would like to thank Emilia Andrejová, who is in charge of the Slovak representation of DGT, and I would like to ask her for a few words.
Thank you, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to be here today, especially this first day of the conference, which is the Translating Europe workshop. Just to mention, the Director General for Translation is organizing every year a Translating Europe Forum, which is a big event held in Brussels. This year it will be on the 8th and 9th of November. You can still register for this event, and it is aimed to gather the stakeholders to discuss the questions that are common to all the translation industry and stakeholders. And this year the focus will be on the translation in the age of data. So translators working with the data as well as data working for translators. And I'm very pleased that also during today we will have the chance to discuss this more in detail. These workshops are basically local events that take place in every member state. They are either follow-up of the forum, or in this case it is an ex-ante of the forum, and I hope that we will also feed the forum that will happen in November. But then there are two more things that I would like to mention today. One is that we are at the EMT University, so this university is part of the European Masters in Translation network, and it is the only one in Slovakia at the moment. But last Friday, the European Commission launched a new call for all the universities that can apply. They have time until 14th of December, so they can submit their application if they fulfill the eligibility criteria. And you will find more information on the dedicated EMT website. And lastly, today happens to be the European Day of Languages. So if I were not here, I would have been organizing some local event in some town in Slovakia. But I managed during the last 2 days to organize a quiz. And so now I'm speaking to all the university students that are also watching us or that are present here. If you love languages, and obviously you do, and follow our Facebook of the representation of the European Commission, where you will find 4 links to 4 online quizzes. One in French, one in German, one in Italian, and one in Polish. And you can win a monthly scholarship at the university in Siena, a weekend trip to Paris, a weekend trip to Krakow, or a monthly, one language course at the Goethe Institute. So you have time until 10th of October and you can test your skills. But obviously I'm very happy to be here and discuss with you everything that is common to us, and I hope that you will have an enjoyable time during the conference, and I thank the organizers for making it possible.
much, Emilia. Also, thank you for all the information. I just have a quick question. Can academics participate as well?
Well, they have to prove that they are university students, so if you still are, you can.
Okay, so maybe that's something for our PhD students, because they still count. Thank you very much. Dear colleagues and guests, it's about time to officially open the main conference program, and I know that there will be plenty of time for thank yous in the end. However, there are several people who I want to mention now, because the conference wouldn't take the form it does. First of all, I would like to thank you and also introduce my colleague from the co-organizing institutions, and especially Dr. Martin Djocios from Bell University, who is here with us today. I would also like to thank Dr. Ivana Hostova from Prešov University, who is also here. Then I would like to thank Dr. Pavel Šveda from Comenius University and Professor Maria Kusa from the Institute of World Literature. I'm not sure if they arrived yet, but they will be joining us later today. And I would like to thank also Emilia as one of the co-organizers of this part. I'm very happy to welcome very important and very significant speakers, which we invited as our keynote speakers. So I'm happy to welcome Professor Edwin Gensler, Professor Daniel Gilles and Professor Andrew Chesterman, who are here with us today. And I want to thank them not only for joining us, but also for helping us with the selection process when we were choosing the proposals of the conference, as well as I would like to thank all of the members of our scientific committee. However, our conference is not only scientific, as you heard already. Just to mention very quickly our sponsors, because thanks to them we could make this event possible as well. I would like to thank the companies Lexman, Exe, Lexica, Translata and ASAP Translation for their contribution and their cooperation. And I would also like to thank the professionals. I would like to thank the Slovak Associations of Translators and Interpreters and the Association of Translation Companies of Slovakia, who are also participating on the conference programs. My most sincere thanks and personal thanks go to my colleagues from our department, who invested a lot of energy to this event in the whole last year, so I'm sure you will have a chance to discuss everything with them as well. Ladies and gentlemen, if you remember the call for proposals for our presentation, you remember that it posed several very difficult questions regarding translation and interpreting studies. Before I turn the conference to the chairman of the very first session, I would also like to thank you for all of your interest and your input. Let me now close you by wishing you all a delightful and stimulating event, and I would be very happy to welcome Dr. Martin Djocios, who will be chairing the session, and the first of our keynote speakers, Professor Edwin Gensler. Thank you very much.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, welcome. I'm very glad to see you here. Dear distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, it's my great honor, and I must say pleasure, to introduce one of the most influential thinkers of translation studies today, Edwin Gensler. I believe it is up to call him a thought-provoker, game changer, or even paradigm shifter. His works always launch very lively debates, and I trust that today it will be no different. I first met Professor Gensler in 2012 at Nitre School of Translation Studies in Misano, Italy, and right after seeing him publicly debating TS paradigms with Anthony Pym, I resolved to one day welcome him in Slovakia. 6 years later, here we are. And I believe that this is his first conference appearance in Central Europe ever. Certainly not the last one, I hope. Edwin Genzel's research interests include translation theory, literary translation, and post-colonial theory. He is the author of Translation and Rewriting in the Age of PostTranslation Studies, that's his latest book, then Translation and Identity in the Americas, and Contemporary Translation Theories. He co-edited with Mario Timochko the anthology Translation and Power, which includes essays by many distinguished scholars. He is also the author of many seminal papers and articles. He's a member of the advisory board of several recognized and important journals. He lectures widely on issues of translation theory and culture, including most recently addresses in China, Mexico, England, Italy, Austria, Ireland, Spain, Argentina, Peru, and Brazil. In his latest book, he argues, and I quote now, "The field of translation studies is still restricted, primarily focused on written text and two-way comparisons and neglecting pre- and post-translation conditions and effects." He then adds that translation is not merely a footnote to history, but one of the most vital forces available to introducing new ways of thinking and inducing significant cultural change. He says that the aim of a new generation of translators is less to achieve linguistic accuracy and more to facilitate communication, open avenues for advancement, and to change the way many think about majority and minority encounters. He suggests, among other stimulating ideas, in line with Basnet and Lefebvre, that all writing is rewriting, or better said, rewriting, and translation. Interlingual, and intersemiotic plays a significant role in that process. Dear ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues, please welcome Professor Edwin Genzel. Edwin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Mark. All right, now it's red up here, so, okay. Red means go. Thank you, Martin. I can't believe that it's been 6 years since we met at Misano. It's incredible. Martin was one of the most active participants in this conference, always asking questions. And I think that's the main topic of what I've been thinking about upon the invitation. I really love the questions posed in the call for papers. They're really provocative, and I've been thinking about them quite a bit. I really want to thank Martin and Emilia Perez. There's two Emilias here, I think, for inviting me and having this idea and getting the funding and putting together a wonderful organizing committee. Bringing together so many people from so many parts of the world. This is a real thrill for me. One of the books I wrote was Contemporary Translation Theories. It was published in about 1990, and there I talked about 5 different theories of translation. And I had a chapter on translation studies as it's studied in the Low Countries, primarily Belgium. And I divided that up into early translation studies and later translation studies. And in the early part, I put in a whole section on the Nitre Bratislava School of Translation, which I think is absolutely fundamental to the development of the field. And that little section of the book has not been very well received, at least in West Europe. Many of the scholars in Belgium wanted me to say more about what they were working on in the middle and late 1970s, and less about what was going on in Prague and Bratislava and Moscow and other places. So for me, this is a tremendous honor. I'm sure you'll hear this from all the international speakers about how important this whole region was in the scholars who were here and the linguists and the semioticians were to the development of the field. But I'd like to be the first to say that I mean it deeply. This talk has two sections. It's sort of pre-translation studies and post-translation studies. The pre-translation studies material is not very well formulated in my head, so this will be a bit memoir and biographical, a little bit about my road to translation studies, and then the post will be mostly about this book that I've just written. And I will tell you, when the book came out, I received no invitations. And I thought, oh no, this is another one of these theory books that's going to collect dust on shelves forever. No one will read it. And now there's been several invitations that are coming in, and more are following. And it looks like the topic is getting out there. So we will see. The first couple of times I presented some of this material, I've been criticized very heavily. So please feel free to object to some of the things that I'm saying, and let's talk about it. And I think that's what was happening in the 60s in Bratislava and Nitre, and a lot of questions were being asked. Okay. This book has been published in a series with Routledge. There's a new series called New Perspectives in Translation Studies, and Michael Cronin has written a book on eco-translation in that series. Moira Ingeleri has written a book on migration in translation, and there's my book, and then Cher Simon has written that wonderful book on cities in translation. But what you can see is the domain, the space that's being studied now is shifting, say, from the nation to the city, from the city to the neighborhood within the city, from the neighborhood in the city to the smaller communities in the neighborhood, from that neighborhood to households to different generations of people living in those houses. And the whole space of this is shifting to smaller and smaller spaces for studying translation. And I think that's a very healthy development, and that's what this new series is going to be exploring. Let's see if I can get this to work. I'm on. Start Windows. So the cover of this book, it's very palimpsestic. It's there's layers and layers and layers that I'm trying to uncover in my thinking right now about translation. This rewriting topic is very important. My mentors include André Lefebvre, who was part of that Belgian group. He came to the United States in the early 70s, and he'd sort of been kicked out of that Belgian group. They didn't like his work very much, and was so disappointed he never got an appointment there. And he was just floating around the United States without a job, publishing and giving papers to, say, the Midwest MLA organization in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and places like that. Now, he did land on his feet. Miriam Gaddis-Rose gave him a job at Binghamton for a year, and then Austin, Texas picked him up, so he did land on his feet. But it was by no means clear that scholars of that stature were ever going to get a job in academia. When I wrote my dissertation, which was on receptions of translations in different parts of the world. My thesis advisor told me, Edwin, don't do it on translation. You'll never get a job. There are no jobs. This is before there was a field, so it's very difficult. I was lucky enough to get a job in comparative literature, and it's been quite a ride. This book has 5 chapters. I've been talking about post-translation studies for some time now. The discussion started with Stefano Arduini and Sia Nergård in Misano Adriatica. These are semioticians, not translation studies scholars. Arduini works at Urbino and Nergård works in Florence. And they wanted to start a journal. And Umberto Eco was in these discussions, and I was very keen upon it. We've all really wanted Umberto to talk to us more about translation, and it's a real shame that he died without really getting that book out. He did write one book on translation, but it's mostly anecdotes and memoirs and comments upon people who've translated his own work. But there's a whole group of his students in Bologna who are very keen on translation studies and intersemiotic approaches to translation. So we got this journal off the ground, and it's Arduini and Nergård who came up with the concept of post-translation studies, not me, and have been talking about it for, well, did they start in 2012? Were discussions about it?
That was official introduction of the journal. They wrote the paper in 2011, but in 2012 they officially launched the discussion.
Yeah. So the idea's been out there for a while, but it's been fairly abstract. And what I tried to do in this book was to give practical examples of how post-translation studies approach might work. So, yes, there's quite a bit of theory in this book too, in the introduction and the conclusion. But I go through 4 case studies: A Midsummer Night's Dream in Germany, Post-Colonial Faust, Proust for Everyday Readers, and Hamlet in China. And I cover different periods of translation. The Midsummer Night's Dream, of course, goes through an Elizabethan period. Post-Colonial Faust, Goethe's writing Faust in the 18th century and early 19th century in Germany. And it's a very key time for translation. It's a golden age of translation in Germany. Proust for Everyday Readers gets into modernism, especially modernism in France. Modernism is not just restricted to one country. And then the Hamlet in China is really talking about today and the boom in translation in China. And in the writing of the book, I'm looking at sort of 3 things. In each chapter, I talk about how the translational culture, say, of Elizabethan England, provides a context for the subsequent creative writing. So translation is not something that comes after creative writing, but translation is something that comes before. Shakespeare, of course, was not known for his languages. Ben Jonson says Shakespeare had little Greek and less Latin. But nevertheless, he writes incredibly well of Denmark and Italy and other places. So that's the first section is devoted to a sort of boom in translations in the context, in the environment of a country or a space or a city in which incredible creative writing emerges. And that is an important piece of post-translation studies. Ironically, post-translation studies looks at pre-original writing culture. Sherry Simon does this very well in her Translations and Cities. Without the dynamic translation culture of Montreal, there wouldn't be this boom in creative writing Without the boom in translations in something like Zurich, there would be no James Joyce. Without the boom in translation in Kolkata, there wouldn't be a Tagore. And this pre-original writing space, the argument is, of course, that there are translation markers in all of this original writing, and the post-translation studies scholars are going to be the ones that have to figure it out. It taps into a history of translation studies, scholars talking about how there's really very little difference between an original and a translation. So I'm sure you've all gotten into that. The second piece of each chapter goes through the traditional translation studies approach. And I'm not calling for an end of translation studies proper, if that's a way we might characterize. The Belgians came up with a wonderful descriptive process for comparing original translations. They base a lot of that on Popovich's work on shifts in translation. It's been so valuable this period to come up with different units and be able to compare how they do or do not translate across cultures, and then how practicing translators solve those problems. It's been a wonderful methodology, and we have learned so much from really 3 decades of work going on the comparison of translations. And in my case studies, it's really fascinating. Post-colonial Faust, I looked at the translation history into English. And I'm from the United States. My last name is Gensler. I'm Germanic American. My grandmother spoke German. And I did quite a bit of research on this, and I looked at, for example, I looked at this catalog of libraries in the state of Pennsylvania in 1905 or something like that. And they did 30 years, and there must have been 50 or 60 translations of Faust just in Pennsylvania during that time period. I think every German professor or German teacher in the state of Pennsylvania translated Faust and published it someplace. And this is, I digress a little bit, but at Vanderbilt University I worked on this project called RARGL, the German reception, or the American reception of German language literature. And I read thousands of articles and reviews and translations and cataloged them in the early days of binary codes. And I wrote a little paragraph on each one. We finally sold that to Yale University. It became part of their database. But I did read hundreds of these little local journals on the reception of German language literature in the United States. Proust, on the other hand, one translator. He's lasted 100 years. No one has replaced him. Now, it is true that Oxford is coming out with a new team translation of Proust. I think they've hired 7 translators to get started on it, and several of the volumes are out. But it's very interesting to do this kind of translation work, rigorous work, and look at translations to see what they're doing and why one Goethe translation becomes the dominant one for a period of time. Why, for example, with Proust translations, no one else seems to be even able to get into the market. And then the third piece, and this is the most important piece, and I'll probably talk a little bit about that today, is the post-translation effects, aftershocks, reception. And it's not just enough to look at reviews of translations. What I'm interested in is, are the creative writers reading this translation? Is, for example, the modernism of Proust being translated into the English language? Are other creative writers picking up on stream of consciousness techniques and incorporating that into their writing? Is the translation, say it's a women's studies or a feminist article, are women reading that? Are they changing the way they think about a certain text or a culture? Does it motivate them to become more active in the work that they do in their culture or not? Or on and on and on. Where I'm interested in, how do translations change a culture? How do you get a new idea into a culture? How do you get, I don't know, it can be any kind of an idea, a religion, a political philosophy, an economic approach to solving micro problems. How do you get these ideas translated across culture and into another system or polysystem, as it were? So those are the three sections of each chapter, and then at the end I do some generalizing about that. So I'm going to go over this very quickly. These are some of my musings and some of the questions. And although there were many questions posed in the call for paper, I think this is a good time for asking more questions. A lot of scholars, at least in the literature of translation studies, attribute the beginning of translation studies to these three series of conferences that went on at Leuven, Tel Aviv, and Antwerp. And these are incredibly important conferences. There's no doubt about it. And it's a very unique group of people that were getting together and talking about this, from José Lambert to Itamar Evans-O'Hare to Susan Bassnett to André Lefebvre. It's how do you start a new discipline from nothing? It's a very difficult thing to do. And I admire these people greatly. They were asking a lot of questions at the time. Well, I'm missing a slide here, but I'll go back. José Lambert is probably the best person for posing questions after an academic presentation that I have ever met. You can give this wonderful presentation, say, on metaphor and translation, which I did at the time, and he'll sit back there and say, oh, have you considered translating metaphor into non-metaphor? Have you considered adding new metaphors where nothing needs? He just pushes your thinking every time. If you think, oh, you're talking about systems theory, you're talking about what's included in the system, but have you thought about what's not included in the system and why? God, I've worked 3 or 4 months preparing this talk, and you're just tearing it apart in one seemingly simple question. I think that negatively affected how much he actually published it. But he would come to conferences like this. He would sit in the back and listen to everything. When the presenter would finish, up his hand would go, and then we were off. And I think that's one of the reasons why the theories that came out of Leuven were so solid and held up so well for so long. And I value his friendship. This seems to have a life of its own, which is probably good. I could talk about this in order or not in order. That's why it's not, I don't like PowerPoint, because they're so linear or so ABC. My ideas are very fertile right now, and they're spiraling, and I'm not sure where they're going, but I like the feel of the bubbles. But as solid as this Belgian group was and how important they are to the discipline, and I really want to emphasize that I use their methodologies all the time, and I use their case studies all the time. There is very definitely a pre-translation studies period, and this is going on in Nitre and Bratislava, and it's also going on in the United States. This new criticism is emerging in the United States. And I get very tired of all these people that say, Evan, this new criticism is just subjective and eclectic, and there's no system to it at all. No, it's exactly the opposite. These new critics are very seriously studying what makes a text literary, and how does form complement content to make an aesthetic object. And they're not that different from many of the questions that were going on in Prague. And indeed, Jakobson came to the United States in 1941, and he was teaching at MIT, and he was publishing in English quite a bit. He would quote John Pro Ransom, who wrote New Criticism also in 1941. There was a real cross-fertilization of ideas. And then my teacher on Prog Structuralism was a guy named Francesc Galan. And I don't know, this is a real question to anybody in the audience. He wrote a wonderful book in English on Prog Structuralism. I don't know if he's from this area or not. I think he must be. I know he did study in Canada for a while under Northrop Frye, and he helped bring Northrop Frye's sort of anatomy of criticism and history of criticism to the United States. He taught at Texas Austin for a while, and then he ended up late in his career at Vanderbilt, that's where I learned my Prog Structuralism. The questions that were being asked included: what elements make a text literary? How do we avoid subjective impressions? Are literary elements translatable? What is translatability? How do structure and content interact to make an aesthetic object? How do literary translations evolve? Prog Structuralists did this better than the new critics, but the Prog Structuralists were looking quite a bit at how a culture evolves, or the evolution. What's the diacritical paradigm? What's the history? And this is where the new critics did learn quite a bit from Northrop Frye on his models. But this evolution of literary translations. And what I want to do is take that literary evolution one step further and look at that post-translation evolution. How do translations morph into other forms of art, of film, of theater, of music, of blogs, of reading groups, of fan fiction, etc. I'm looking at that last stage of evolution in my research right now. I also worked at the International Writing Program at the University of Iowa for many years, and here again, 1964 we had our first graduate translation course, and it was a workshop approach. So all you people participating in the EC workshops this week, great. I'd like to see how the workshop works over here. National Translation Center was founded in 1965. First issue of our translation journal, Modern Poetry and Translation, which had translations as well as translation criticism, edited by Danny Weisbord and Ted Hughes. And in 1977, the National Humanities Grants starts their translation grant program, and Maria Tomashko was the first winner of a translation grant to study translations from Old Irish. Questions raised at Iowa is, can translation be taught to college students? How? What should be taught? Theory, history, practice. In Iowa, we pretty much landed on history and practice. We didn't do a lot in theory. Is translation part of the establishment or the counterculture? This is a very important question. Translation at that time in the 60s in the United States was very much a countercultural movement. It was a very monolingual culture. It was sort of Eisenhower years of the 50s. It was a fairly conservative period, and translation, many of our translators are publishing in the Village Voice and the Rolling Stone and sort of underground journals and small journals. Robert Bly has a journal called the 50s, which became the 60s. Farragut, Grant's is starting. It really became a kind of countercultural movement. And that's why Hughes was so enamored with it. And, it goes along with the music as well. It may be similar to what was going on in Slovakia. I understand that there was quite a bit of interest in rock and roll and blues and jazz during that period, and I understand there was a lot of underground literature of which translation played a very important role. I would like to learn a lot more about that. I see some heads going, yeah. All right, so we'll go to the clubs tonight, all right? How do new ideas enter a culture? This is the time when there's great exploration. The Beatles go to India. Ferlinghetti goes to Mexico. Burroughs goes to Mexico. Experimenting with drugs is going on. New ways of seeing new forms. And then, importantly, how is translation related to creative writing? And this is a very important topic. The seeds were planted at that time for me in Iowa, and they continue to this day. I also studied in Berlin for many years with Armin Paul Frank. I was over at his house every Friday night for 2 years. We translated Eliot's The Wasteland. Played guitar, had meals, talked about culture. And he's working on this idea of tradition and the individual talent. This becomes very important. Tradition and the individual. Tradition and the individual. What I miss from polysystems theory, as great as it is it's like the target culture dictates what the translators do. And I don't think that's true. I think translators decide what translators do. And this is where translator studies by one of my prominent colleagues becomes so important to the field. Frank, of course, moved to Göttingen in '85, and with Harold Kissel founded the Göttingen Center for the Study of Literary Translation. And their research was primarily into how anthologies are put together. And then they came up with a theory of translation called the transfer theory of translation, which very much was developed against the target approach theory that was going on in Belgium. And there were very lively discussions and disagreements going at the time between Göttingen and Leuven. Anthony Pym began his career with a postdoc fellowship at Göttingen. This is not going in order at all. I also taught in the Netherlands for 5 years at Utrecht, and there I was working with I've forgotten his name. Tone came later after I left. Wolfgang Herlitz, and I was teaching translation in a communication department. And Herlitz was working on reception theory, Jauss, Iser, and other people like that. But this was before '76, so at the time in the Netherlands, I was working at Utrecht, which later did start a translation studies program, and Ton Nijkens was hired as the director of that. But at this time, the translation was being taught in communication studies. And I would go to Amsterdam often, and there was Kitty van der Svaak. She had a PhD program going in translation studies. Their program was founded, I think, in 1964. James Holmes was there. He was an American who was there. They had a couple of very bright PhD students working on translations. And they were using shifts in translation as well. They were using Popovich quite a bit. Well, I want to talk just a second about James Holmes. This is a bit of an anecdote, and I'm not too sure how proper it is at an academic setting. James Holmes was from Iowa, and I was working at the International Writing Program in Iowa for many years as a translator. And he would come through there every year. His parents were at Red Oak, Iowa. And he would come back, and he would tell me all these stories about translation in Europe, in Amsterdam, in Utrecht, in Leuven, in Bratislava, in Moscow. He told me about a trip that he and André Lefebvre took, and this must have been in the early 60s, to Bratislava, and they met Popovich, and then the three of them went off to Moscow. Holmes is gay, and at that time very gay. He wore black leather jackets and chains, and he was really very out. And the thought of the three of them going to Bratislava and then continuing on to Moscow and walking around is a bit jarring to me. But he said they had the greatest time. Right? He told me a little bit about the underground poetry scene, music scene, film scene. But he would come back to Iowa. We organized a talk for him on translation studies, and 4 people would show up, whereas W.S. Merwood would come and talk about translation, and 400 people would show up. This translation studies did not translate across the Atlantic very well at the time. But it's Holmes also, his interdisciplinary approach and his questions and his traveling and talking to people and serving as a kind of ambassador. And he did try to bring European translation studies to Iowa and tell us what was going on. We wouldn't listen to him. He did go to Moscow and try to talk about translation studies, what was going on in Amsterdam. I'm not too sure. Moscow Linguistics Institute is still going really strong. But anyway, Holmes becomes important to this talk, of course, because of this 1970 anthology about the Bratislava Conference in '68. And I would say that's the beginning of translation studies right there. It happened here. And for some reason, this particular anthology isn't listed in the sort of historiography generated in I'll tell you a little story about the name and nature of translation studies, too. I had heard this quoted quite a bit, so I tried to find that article, the 1972 article, and I couldn't find it. No library alone could find it in America. I came to Amsterdam and looked for it. I came to Leuven and looked for it. Nobody could find it. And then finally, I did find it, and it was just a sort of pre-publication mimeograph. I don't know if you remember those purple. Maybe you probably don't. You're all too young. But it was interesting how much this was being quoted and how that there wasn't an original of it. But this is typical. A lot of what was going on in the 70s weren't published. A lot of it is in sort of pre-publication form, handouts for conferences, discussions afterwards late into the night. And that's the dynamic quality and the unformed quality and the fluid quality of the field that was so exciting at the time. And I think that's where, when we want to continue, I think that's a great starting point to continue for the future. So let me get to my book. The ideas for this book came primarily from a talk in Brazil at a conference called Transfusão at the Casa Guilherme de Almeida. And this was not an academic conference. This was a music, architecture, dance conference. I'm very interested in translation and architecture. Transfusal means transfusion. So there was for example, there was a translator of Cole Porter songs. And the song that I remember, I think you probably know it here, birds do it, bees do it, even educated fleas do it. It's a really phonetic translation, a lot of wordplay, a lot of pun, a lot of fun. Cape cod clams do it, even lazy jellyfish do it. And the translator of this would work on one verse for months. One song could take him up to 6 months to do. Brazilians are very good at phonetic translation, maybe the best in the world. And the songs were then performed in a kind of a tropicalismo band. And so it was not just translation for written, but it was translation for performance. I learned a lot there. I was asked to go talk about Lefebvre and rewriting there, so that's what I talked about. And I do note that Routledge has reissued Lefebvre's book on translation and rewriting, which is a good sign for the field. That's a very important book if you haven't taken a look at that. In India, I was at what was called a Confest, and I talked a little bit about a conference festival. And there's a lot of performance there. And I remember I gave a talk on 50 different Faust translations. And a scholar got up after me and did a paper on 1,000 versions of Ramayana. So I felt like my Faust translation just got buried by somebody else that was doing an afterlife of translation. My teacher of Indian translation is Harsh Trivedi, and he talks about translation in India. Anuvat. Anuvat means, at least according to Trivedi, not carrying across, but coming after. And I do think that this definition of translation as a coming after is very important to my thinking today on post-translation studies. Okay. I'm going to go on for just a little bit. And then, of course, my conversations with their garden are going. These are some of the definitions of post-translation studies. We imagine a new era that could be termed post-translation studies, where translation is viewed as a fundamentally transdisciplinary, mobile, and open-ended. And Simon says, I give translation an expanded definition, writing that is inspired by the encounter with tongues, including the effects of creative interference. So writing, this is not just translational writing, this is all kinds of writing that's inspired by translation. And this can be in government, this can be in judiciary systems, this can be in history, this can be in philosophy, this can be in... And that's what I'm really interested in. This is an important book called Translation Effects that's out by The Shaping of Canadian Cultures. And they look at the effects, mostly on judiciary systems in Quebec, but also on the effects of translation on First Nations. Some of these effects are very traumatic, as you might well imagine. I think this post-translation studies approach connects very well to world literature. And this is coming up all over the world. Susan Basson's speaking on world literature today in Boston, as I'm speaking to you in Nitre. But how Midsummer travels first to Germany, and then is translated into Russian, then it gets into France, and then it's performed in the United States, and it gets translated in an opera, and it gets performed at the Met in New York as the opening act for maybe 50 years in a row. And then, only then, it's not performed for over 200 years in England. And then it comes back to England after this incredible travel and this rewritings and trans-adaptations becomes important. Bassnett has said much time has been wasted on attempting to differentiate between translations, versions, and adaptations. I think that's really true. There are 2 journals of adaptation studies that are out there right now. They've been published for 5 years. One's with Oxford. I forget where the other one is. And I looked through the bibliographies. Only 2 translation scholars have published anything in there. John Milton on children's literature, and then Larry Venuti has an article on a film. But why isn't there more cross-fertilization between adaptation studies and translation studies? Jeanette is coming back. Any writing is a rewriting. Literature is always in the second degree. And this is the quote that Martine talked about. I do think in terms of rewritings, in a very long and deep semiotic chain. Linda Hutcheon as well. All writing is a form of storytelling, and storytellers are multiplying and finding new forms for outlets. She allows for TV, radio, music, opera, ballet, websites, video games, YouTubes, and theme parks. This book is enjoying a very nice life. It's been issued in a second version, adding all sorts of new Twitter and fan fiction and things like that. Let me just show you this, and then I'll stop. So here's selected theater productions of Faust. And you can see that in Germany there's a kind of a very sort of, Faust is a huge hero in Germany. I'm sure you know this. But in East Germany, starting with Bertolt Brecht and continued through Benedict's, there's a rethinking of this kind of capitalist, imperialist, conquering, traveling, exploitative, sexist hero, and rethinking it in terms of a different approach. And then it gets picked up. I was looking at Brazilian versions, and I want to show a clip from this South African version by William Kentridge. And here Faust is a puppet. Loaded. Well, let me shift. I'll show you a trailer for well, I'm sorry, my videos aren't working. Faustus in Africa. directed by William Kentridge. Faust is a light-skinned puppet. Wagner is black. Gretchen is a nurse. She is black. Mephisto is a black. He's a telegraph operator. God is off stage. He's referred to as male, but the voice is female. And then Faust goes on what's called a seduction safari. He travels all around Africa. He hunts big game. He butchers big game. He cooks big game. He devours big game. He buys Ifu heads. He sleeps with women. He sleeps with Gretchen, who's a nurse at a leper colony, and then he abandons her. And at the end, the play becomes a Faust. There's a reckoning, and the blacks have taken over in South Africa. There's a truth commission, and Wagner is now a member of the Truth Commission. So he's interviewing Faust, and Faust is begging for redemption, and that's how the play ends. It will be interesting to see how this play has been performed in many Germanic-speaking countries, in Austria, in Denmark, in Sweden. It'll be interesting to see if the Handspring Puppet Theater ever gets an invitation to perform this in Germany. But I think my argument here, it's a little bit like Caliban in Latin America. Caliban, you can't really do Shakespeare in London anymore without giving sort of equal time and merit to the Caliban figure. And here, I think the international reception of Faust is changing the way even Faust can be presented. So this is, once again, how post-translation rewritings impact original. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Edwin, for a very stimulating talk. And now I would like to open the discussion. So, do we have any questions? Yes, please.
Hey, thank you.
Microphone, please.
Yes,
Microphone.
thank you. Can you hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you, Professor Gensler, for your exciting talk. I really look forward to hearing more anecdotes from you, since I'm a translation historian and it's become a bit of my trade to deal with anecdotes. My name is, by the way, Igor Teja. I'm from the local Department of Translation Studies, and if I may, I have two questions, or questions, comments, treat them however you will. My first one is that from the point of view of translation history and from my own research as a translation historian, I have come to understand that we use an awful lot of myths and bullet points when we present something. So when I don't know, look at Professor Chesterman, and I have a typical graduate student, well, Chesterman means and translator studies. When I look at Martin Diocos, he's sociology of translation. When I look at Emilia Perez, she's audiovisual translation, and so on and so forth. And my question is, bullet points and myths are quite easy to sell, but they're doing us a great disservice. So, and this is my point with structuralism. We tend to oversimplify structuralism, and we kind of take it like this rigid system, this Saussure structuralism, very rigid, doesn't really give much wiggle room for fluidity. And what do you think about this? Aren't we supposed to get more complex histories and do not get bullet points when it comes to our histories? So this is my first thing, if I may. And my second thing is this. We, as humanities people, deal an awful lot with metaphors and interpretations, and I think you will all agree that we do. And if we take translation, we take the concept of translation, we seek to establish its factuality across all fields of life. So what I mean by this is that we establish its factuality and we gain ground. But aren't we spreading the metaphor of translation too far? Because according to Umberto Eco, there is a difference between interpretation and using something. There is a limit to interpretation. So, okay, sorry for bothering you too long, and thank you for hearing from you, and thank you once again for the brilliant presentation.
Thank you very much. Edwin?
Thank you. Very quickly, yes, this bullet point approach to any theory is really not the way to study the translation theory. George Steiner said that translation is the most complex cognitive activity known to man. And it is incredibly complex, philosophically, linguistically, communicationally, and we're really just scratching the surface. I was talking with Susan Baston a little bit about this as well. When she and I started studying translation, we read everything. I mean, we read everything. We read our Marx, our Kant, our Schleiermacher, our Heidegger, we read them in the original. And we had to tease a lot of this out. The bullet points weren't quite ready yet. The presentations weren't out there. We had to read through mountains of hermeneutics to find Schleiermacher's theses on translation. At UMass, we teach, well, we've got people read all of Nitre. We have people read all of Itamar Ibn Zohar. We have people read all of Gideon Turi. The students complain. They say this is too hard. You know, we don't even understand Ibn Zohar's vocabulary here. What is going on? Can you give us some bullet points? No, you got to read the whole thing. I do think that these anthologies of translation studies, I mean, if you read one little essay on Derrida and relevance theory, you're not getting all of Derrida. What Derrida has to say about translation is very, very unsettling, and it has really very little to do with translation studies definitions of translation or linguistics definitions of translation. Yes, I teach a post-colonial theory class in translation, and the students have to read everything. It's heavy going. But I think they become better translators. And I know there's a lot of practicing translators in the room. We were talking a little bit about this last night at dinner. The theory really helps practicing translators. If you know that there's a target approach theory that's very dominant in the field, and you've read through these anthologies that I've put up there in these conference proceedings, you will feel more emboldened to say, well, heck, this Slovakian concept doesn't really exist in Russian or French or German or whatever language you're going into. So I have the right to change it because these target translator theorists tell me that that's what practicing translators do. So you get empowered. Oh, can I insert a little feminist secret code into this? Well, Sherry Simon says that's okay. So I'm going to smuggle this in. And it really, what we found in Massachusetts is that it gives you a larger repertoire of choice. And translators that have more choices available to them can find a better solution. So we found that it works, the two work very well together. But I'd be interested to talk to all of you about what you're reading and how much or little theory you're doing and what your film studies theories are, or what your communication theories are, or what your AV theories are, and how they affect the way you practice translation. I really do think that the future of translation is in these newer forms of media. As for your second question, I think that's the question of the whole conference, and we'll be talking about that for a while. If you make the definition of translation too open, if you bring in too many discussions, does that dilute the topic that you're trying to teach, you're trying to study, you're trying to learn, you're trying to practice? That's a real question. That's why I'm not saying let's abandon translation studies, let's keep it. But there's a new form or a branch of translation studies that's emerging, and that's the study of translation effects. Do translations change a person? If I read Umberto Eco in translation, am I more open to semiotic approaches to translation or not? I think a lot of people have not been on our field. I think I personally am, and it has changed my thinking, but it hasn't really made that much headway into the field. So that's a very good question, and we'll talk about it for, I hope, a couple of days. Thank you for that.
Thank you very much, and we have space for one last question, please.
My name is Marketa Števková and I work at the Comenius University in Bratislava. Thank you, Professor Gensler, for this very nice overview of the history of translation studies. I come just back from a conference in Leuven, and Professor Lambert sent you a lot of greetings, if I may. But I would like to put a question which is connected with this Leuven School of Translatology. They move their thinking actually to the translation policy and the role of the translation policy also in the reception of the literature. But actually, now they are thinking about the role of the translation policy also in the legal translation and the impact on of the translation policy in how we see actually the world and the multilingualism and the future of translation at all. So just a philosophical question, what is your view on this topic?
Yes, I can remember José Lambert talking about what is the translation policy of this culture, this legal system, this literary press, this government, this church. These questions have been going on for some time. And the way Leuven's been approaching it is look at the context of the translation, whether it's a legal system or a social system or a medical system or literary system in the source culture, and then looking at that same system in the target culture. And then how do you sort of, maybe a text has been very, very influential. Maybe the Me Too movement in the US judicial system becomes very important. Well, if you translate that Me Too system to, say, another system that's maybe more or less discriminatory towards women, what is the role, what is the place of that translation in that judicial or legal system? I think that's crucially important. I think translation studies have neglected the context in which translations emerge too much, and that's that pre-translational space that I'm talking about. And then, yes, what are the repercussions in the post-translation space? Now, you may think, say, during the communist days of Slovakia that there were better women's rights than in, say, West Germany or something like that, you try to bring in a West German feminist text or something into Slovakia at the time, and the whole rights of women are very different. I don't know, better education, more daycare available, better. So maybe some of those things don't translate, but maybe some of them do. So Lambert and the Leuven group will look at how do you. There's some very important points in this German document. On paper, there's a lot of rights for women in a communist Slovakia system, but in practice, they're doing double duty. They're cooking and chopping and cleaning and taking care of the kids, and so maybe it's different, and then you have to be aware of that. And maybe some of the West German women's rights groups' ideas would translate into the receiving system. And I think this is a real strength. I think we need to do a lot more research on this. The Canadians are really finding that some of these progressive, sort of bilingual, bicultural Quebecois laws, they see them as really progressive, left-wing, radical, supporting the Parti Québécois, supporting the independence movement, but none of the allophones, none of the Moroccans, none of the Haitians voted for the Parti Québécois. None of the indigenous peoples voted. I think the indigenous people voted 94% against some of this progressive Québécois proposed legislation. So whatever the Parti Québécois was doing, they weren't reaching an audience. And what they're finding in this anthology on translation effects is that the repercussions of even some of the most progressive Québécois laws have been very regressive towards a lot of immigrants that they thought were on their side. So this is an important post-translation aspect of, and that's what I want to investigate. I do care whether the translation is linguistically accurate or acceptable or adequate or whatever the words are for the translation studies academic reception. But what I want to know are people reading this? Are judges taking a look at this? Does it change the way they rule on a case? Are the immigrants being given their equal rights, or is this just another way to keep them down? So it goes more than the linguistic adequacy of the translation, and that next step is missing, and I think José and I very much agree on this. Thank you.
Thank you very much for your questions and for your answers. I think that we will continue with our discussions during the coffee break, and I believe that throughout the whole conference we will have a chance to get back to these ideas and discuss them maybe even more thoroughly. Thank you very much, and see you after the coffee break.